On a warm Georgia morning, the sun rose over quiet suburban streets, spilling golden light across rows of modest homes. Richard Coleman woke before dawn, as he always did, pouring his coffee and lacing up his work boots. At 42, Richard wasn't a man who chased excitement. He believed in steady routines, in loyalty, and in the simple dignity of providing for his wife, Marissa. To his neighbors, he was the kind of man you waved to across the fence, dependable, strong, and maybe a little too serious. Marissa was different. Younger, lively, the sort of woman who drew glances when she entered a room. She had married Richard 10 years earlier, and together they had built what seemed like a stable life. But lately, Richard had noticed changes. Marissa's laugh didn't come as easily. Her eyes often seemed distant. She had grown quiet at dinner, distracted, as if her thoughts belonged to someone else. That morning, she told him she had a routine gynecologist appointment. Richard offered to drive her, a gesture of care he hoped might bridge the gap he felt growing between them. Marissa hesitated, just long enough for him to notice, but finally nodded with a thin smile. As he guided their old Chevy truck down the road, Richard stole glances at her profile. She sat turned toward the window, lost in thought, her hands folded tightly in her lap. He wanted to ask what was wrong, to demand answers for the distance in her eyes, but he swallowed the words. Instead, he told himself that maybe this appointment, this small act of support, might be the beginning of healing whatever had slipped between them. He had no way of knowing that by the end of the day, his entire world would be reduced to blood, betrayal, and the echo of a gunshot. Dinner at the Coleman house had become a quiet affair. Where there once was laughter and conversation, now there was only the dull scrape of silverware against plates. Richard noticed it every night. The way Marissa pushed her food around instead of eating, the way she avoided his eyes as if meeting them might expose something she didn't want him to see. One evening, unable to stand the silence any longer, Richard set down his fork. "Marissa," he said, his voice low but steady. "What's going on with you lately? You've been distant. Is there something I should know?" Her fork paused in midair. She forced a small laugh, too sharp, too rehearsed. "Nothing's wrong. I'm just tired, that's all. Work's been stressful. Stop worrying so much." But Richard knew her too well. The tone in her voice wasn't weariness, it was deflection. Still, he nodded, swallowing his unease. Pushing her would only drive her further away, and the last thing he wanted was to lose her completely. When he confided in his friend Earl at the auto shop, Earl gave him the kind of look a man gives when he's afraid of speaking the truth aloud. "Maybe she's just burned out, Rich. Women go through seasons. But if your gut's telling you something's off, maybe you should trust it." Richard did trust his gut, and it twisted tighter every day. Marissa's phone seemed glued to her hand. She stepped outside to take calls. She came home late, brushing off his questions with excuses that sounded too neat, too practiced. The gynecologist appointments became more frequent, too. She claimed it was routine, checkups, nothing unusual, but Richard couldn't ignore the timing, the way her mood shifted after each visit. On the morning of her next appointment, Richard made a decision. "I'll take you this time," he said casually as he sipped his coffee. Her reaction was immediate, a flicker of panic in her eyes before she forced another thin smile. "Really? You don't have to. It's just a quick visit." "I know," he replied, setting his mug down. "But I want to. I want to be there for you." She didn't argue further, but he could feel the tension radiating from her as they rode in silence. Her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles whitened. Richard kept his eyes on the road, his heart pounding harder with every mile. By the time they pulled into the clinic's parking lot, Richard wasn't thinking only about Marissa's health. He was thinking about the questions he hadn't dared ask, about the answers he feared. He told himself this would prove him wrong, that whatever shadows lingered in his mind were nothing but insecurities. He wanted so badly to believe that. But deep down, beneath the love and the loyalty, a darker voice whispered, "Something isn't right." And before the day was over, he would learn that his instincts had been right all along, more right than he could ever wish them to be. The gynecology clinic sat on the edge of town, a squat brick building with mirrored windows that reflected the bright Georgia sun. Richard parked the truck and cut the engine, watching Marissa fidget with the strap of her purse. She wouldn't meet his eyes. "You want me to come in with you?" he asked. She hesitated, her hand frozen on the door handle. "No, it's fine. I'll be quick. Just wait here." But something in Richard snapped. He forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'll come in anyway. Might as well stretch my legs." Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and faint perfume. A receptionist greeted them with a polite smile, her nails tapping the keyboard as she checked Marissa in. Richard sat beside his wife in the waiting room, his broad shoulders tense, his eyes scanning the room as if answers might be written on the beige walls. Marissa shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "You don't have to sit through this. It's embarrassing." "I don't mind," he said simply, though the knot in his chest told another story. Moments later, a nurse in scrubs appeared, calling Marissa's name. "We'll just get your vitals." Richard rose automatically, but the nurse stopped him with a practiced smile. "I'm sorry, sir. We'll bring her back to see Dr. Henderson. You'll need to wait here." Richard froze at the mention of the name. Henderson. He'd heard it before. Marissa had dropped it casually, too casually, in past conversations. "Oh, Dr. Henderson is so professional, so attentive." Something about the way she had said it, the softness in her voice, had bothered him. And now, as the nurse led his wife down the hall, that same unease gnawed at him harder than ever. He sat stiffly, eyes fixed on the door that had just swallowed them. The minutes dragged like hours. He flipped through a magazine without seeing a single page. The murmur of voices, the faint clatter of instruments somewhere behind the closed doors, all of it made his skin crawl. When the door finally cracked open, a young nurse stepped out with a chart in her hands. She moved quickly, but in that fleeting second, Richard caught something he wasn't supposed to. The angle of her body left the door open just wide enough for him to glimpse inside. It was nothing conclusive, just Marissa on the exam table, laughing nervously, her hand brushing against Dr. Henderson's arm as he leaned in too close. But it was enough. Enough to ignite every suspicion he had been burying for months. The nurse shut the door with a click, unaware of what she had just revealed. Richard's pulse thundered in his ears. He shifted forward in his seat, staring at that door as though sheer willpower could rip it from its hinges. His mind raced. Maybe he was imagining it. Maybe the angle made it look worse than it was. But no amount of rationalizing could quiet the storm brewing inside him. He clenched his fists, knuckles white, his breath shallow. He thought of the nights Marissa came home late, the way she avoided his questions, the sudden distance in their marriage. It all pointed here, to this room, to this man she trusted more than her husband. The waiting room around him faded. All he could see was that closed door. All he could hear was the echo of her laughter, intimate, secretive, cutting through him like a knife. Something inside Richard hardened. He knew, without evidence, without proof, that if he pushed open that door, he would find the truth he had been dreading. And in that moment, as his hand drifted toward the weight of the pistol tucked inside his jacket, he realized that today was no ordinary doctor's visit. It was the day his world was about to explode. Richard sat on the edge of the waiting room chair, his body coiled tight, like a spring ready to snap. Every second stretched into eternity, each muffled laugh and shuffle of movement behind that closed exam room door feeding the fire in his chest. He could feel the weight of the pistol under his jacket pressing against his ribs. He had carried it for years, a habit born from long drives through rough neighborhoods, and the belief that a man should be ready to protect what was his. But in that moment, The gun felt less like protection and more like destiny. Finally, unable to stand another heartbeat of doubt, Richard rose. His boots echoed against the linoleum floor as he crossed the hall. He placed his hand on the cool metal handle of the exam room door and pushed. The scene inside slammed into him like a freight train. Marissa lay back on the exam table, her gown disheveled, her hands clutching at the sides of the sheet beneath her. Dr. Paul Henderson, white coat hanging open, face flushed, was pressed against her in a way no doctor ever should be. Their heads jerked toward the door, eyes wide with panic, as if a spotlight had just exposed their darkest secret. "Richard," Marissa gasped, scrambling upright. "It's not. Please, it's not what you think." But Richard wasn't listening. His vision tunneled, the edges of the room blurring into nothing. All he saw was betrayal, raw, undeniable, screaming at him from the sight before his eyes. "What the hell is this?" Richard's voice shook with fury, his hand trembling as it hovered near his jacket. Henderson raised his hands, his tone calm, patronizing, the way a man might speak to a child. "Mr. Coleman, take a breath. I can explain." "Explain?" Richard's voice rose, cracked. "You think there's an explanation for you touching my wife?" "For this." Marissa slid off the table, her bare feet slapping the floor. She reached for him, her eyes wide with terror. "Richard, listen to me. I didn't mean for this to happen." "Didn't mean?" His laugh was hollow, jagged. "How many times, Marissa? How many damn times have you lied to my face?" The nurse outside pounded on the door. "Doctor? Is everything okay?" But no one answered. Henderson stepped forward cautiously, his palms out. "You're upset, I get that. But you need to put the gun down before you do something you can't take back." The mention of the gun was a spark to dry tinder. Richard hadn't even realized his hand was already gripping the handle, pulling it free. The pistol gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, heavy and certain in his hand. Marissa screamed. "Richard, no. Please." For a split second, time froze. Richard's chest heaved. His eyes darted between his wife and the man who had shattered his life in an instant. His finger rested on the trigger, the weight of rage and humiliation pressing down harder than the gun itself. Henderson's voice broke the silence. Smooth. Confident. Too confident. "You're not going to shoot me. You're angry, but you're not a killer." Richard's jaw tightened. The words cut deep, because in that instant, he didn't know if they were true. Maybe he wasn't a killer. Maybe he was just a man who loved his wife. Too much, too blindly. But then he saw Marissa's eyes, filled not only with fear, but with guilt. That guilt was the nail in the coffin. It was confirmation of everything he dreaded. A single gunshot shattered the air. Henderson's body jerked, a crimson bloom spreading across his chest as he collapsed against the cabinets, then crumpled to the floor. The metallic scent of blood mingled with antiseptic, thick and suffocating. Marissa's scream echoed through the sterile room, raw and guttural. She fell to her knees beside the doctor, her hands slick with his blood as she pressed against the wound in desperation. "Oh my God, what have you done, Richard?" Richard stood frozen, the gun still raised, his hand trembling violently. His ears rang, drowning out the chaos outside as nurses shouted and alarms began to blare. I trusted you," he whispered hoarsely, his eyes locked on Marissa. "Both of you. And this is what I get." She looked up at him, tears streaking her face, her voice breaking. "I made a mistake, but you, God, Richard, you just destroyed everything." The door burst open as security guards and nurses stormed in. Gasps filled the room at the sight of Henderson's lifeless body. Marissa sobbing on the floor, and Richard standing over them with a gun dangling from his hand. He didn't resist. He didn't move. It was as though the shot had taken not only the doctor's life, but his own as well. When the guards finally wrenched the weapon from his grasp and forced his arms behind his back, Richard didn't fight. He barely felt the cold bite of the cuffs. His eyes never left Marissa's face. Those same eyes that once promised him love, now filled with horror and regret. And in that silence, as sirens wailed in the distance, Richard Coleman realized he had crossed a line that no man could ever return from. The exam room had turned into a war zone of screams and chaos. Nurses crowded the doorway, their faces pale with shock, some frozen, others rushing forward only to recoil at the sight of Dr. Henderson's lifeless body slumped against the cabinets. The smell of antiseptic and blood clung to the air like poison. Marissa sobbed uncontrollably on the floor, her hands stained scarlet as she pressed them uselessly against Henderson's chest. Her voice cracked, each cry a mixture of grief and disbelief. No, no, no. Somebody help him. Her tears streamed freely, her shoulders shaking as though she were trying to shake herself out of this nightmare. Richard just stood there. The gun dangled in his hand like a dead weight, his eyes glazed, his body trembling as if the soul had already been stripped from him. He heard the cries, the frantic calls for help, but they came to him through a fog, muffled and distant. Drop the weapon. A security guard shouted as he burst into the room, weapon drawn. Behind him, more guards stormed in, their radios crackling with urgent calls to dispatch. Richard blinked, as if waking from a trance. His gaze shifted from Marissa's tear-streaked face to Henderson's blood-soaked shirt. He didn't move at first, his mind frozen between rage and despair. Then, slowly, almost peacefully, he let the gun slip from his fingers. It clattered onto the tile floor with a sound that felt louder than the gunshot itself. On your knees. Hands behind your head, the guard barked. Richard complied without a word. He lowered himself onto the cold floor, the cuffs snapping shut around his wrists. The metal bit into his skin, but he barely noticed. His eyes stayed locked on Marissa, who sat rocking back and forth beside Henderson's body, her sobs cutting through the sterile silence of the clinic. In the hallway, patients whispered in shock, their voices rising like a storm. Mothers clutched their children close. Nurses guided people out to the parking lot, the entire building vibrating with fear and disbelief. Did you hear that gunshot? Is someone dead? It was her husband. He killed the doctor. The rumors spread faster than the sirens approaching from outside. 2 EMTs rushed in, their gurney rattling against the doorframe. They dropped to their knees beside Henderson, working frantically to find a pulse, to resuscitate him. But the moment they exchanged grim looks, the truth was sealed. The life had already drained from his body. Marissa's scream when they shook their heads pierced Richard deeper than the handcuffs ever could. She collapsed over Henderson's chest, sobbing so violently she could barely breathe. This wasn't supposed to happen, she wailed. God, this wasn't supposed to happen. The police stormed in next, their boots heavy, their commands firm and practiced. We've got the suspect in custody, one officer announced into his radio. Another grabbed Richard by the arm, hauling him to his feet. The room seemed to tilt as they marched him past the body, past Marissa's trembling form. Their eyes met one last time. Her gaze was a storm, part hatred, part grief, part something he couldn't name. Richard wanted to say something, anything, but the words lodged in his throat. What could he possibly say? Sorry. That wouldn't bring back Henderson. That wouldn't erase the betrayal. As they led him through the waiting room, the crowd of onlookers parted, their faces etched with horror, pity, and judgment. Some muttered under their breath. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Richard felt every stare burn into his skin, branding him not as a husband or a provider, but as a murderer. Outside, the blue and red lights painted the clinic walls, sirens still echoing in the distance. Reporters would arrive within the hour. The story was already bigger than the man living it. Richard was shoved into the back of a patrol car. The door slammed shut, the glass separating him from the chaos outside. He leaned back against the seat, closing his eyes. For the first time since the gun went off, he felt the weight of what he had done. He had come to the clinic that morning as a husband, desperate to protect his marriage. Now, he was leaving as a killer, and nothing in the world could turn back the clock. The patrol car rolled through the streets of Atlanta's outskirts, its sirens silenced now, leaving only the distant hum of traffic and the heavy silence inside the vehicle. Richard sat cuffed in the back seat, his wrists raw, his mind replaying the gunshot in endless loops. Each time, the sound seemed louder, sharper, echoing inside his skull until he could barely breathe. At the station, they stripped him of his belongings, wallet, keys, the gold wedding band he had never taken off. When the officer slid that ring off his finger, Richard felt something inside him break. It was as if the last symbol of his life as a husband, of his vows and loyalty, had been confiscated along with his freedom. They led him into a small gray room with a metal table and 2 plastic chairs. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, flickering faintly, adding to the sense of suffocation. Detective Marcus Hill entered, a man in his late 40s with tired eyes and a voice that carried both authority and quiet sympathy. He set a folder on the table and sat across from Richard. "Richard Coleman," the detective began, his tone measured. "You understand why you're here, don't you?" Richard stared at the table, his voice low. "I shot him." "That's right," Hill replied. "You shot Dr. Paul Henderson in front of witnesses in a medical facility in broad daylight. Now, I need to know why. Start from the beginning." Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to scream, to tell the detective about the betrayal, the sight of his wife and that man entangled on the exam table. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was a broken whisper. He was with my wife. I walked in and saw it with my own eyes." Hill leaned back, studying him. "I'm not here to judge what you felt, Richard, but you brought a firearm into that clinic. You pulled the trigger. That wasn't an accident. That was a choice." Richard's hands trembled in the cuffs. "I didn't plan it. I swear to God, I didn't plan to kill anyone. I snapped. You don't know what it's like to see the woman you love in the arms of another man. Not just another man. A man she trusted, a man I trusted." The detective's eyes softened slightly, but his words remained firm. "You're right. I don't know what that feels like. But I do know what it looks like when a good man makes one terrible decision that ruins his life. That's what we're dealing with here." Hours passed. They asked him the same questions again and again. Did he intend to kill Henderson? Had he suspected the affair? Why did he bring a loaded weapon? Each answer was the same. No plan, no premeditation, only blind rage and heartbreak. Still, the facts were undeniable. Henderson was dead. Richard had pulled the trigger. Meanwhile, outside the station, the story had already spread across the evening news. Headlines flashed across television screens. Husband shoots doctor in jealous rage. Cameras lingered outside the clinic where Henderson's colleagues lit candles, mourning a man they called dedicated and beloved. But no one on TV mentioned his affair with Marissa. That detail stayed buried, at least for now, painting Richard as nothing more than a cold-blooded killer. Marissa was interviewed briefly, her face pale, her words trembling. "I never wanted this. Richard is not a monster. He just lost control." Her voice cracked under the weight of grief and guilt, but her plea did little to soften the public's outrage. Back in the interrogation room, Richard slumped in his chair, exhausted. The detective finally closed the folder. "Here's where we stand. The DA is going to charge you with murder. But if your attorney can argue heat of passion, maybe, you'll be looking at manslaughter instead. Either way, your life as you knew it is over." Richard lifted his eyes for the first time, and there was no fire left in them, only emptiness. "It was already over the moment I opened that door," he said. Hill studied him for a long moment, then stood. "We'll let the courts decide." He knocked on the door, and 2 officers entered, hauling Richard to his feet, and leading him toward the holding cells. As the door slammed shut behind him, Richard sat alone on the cold steel bench, the echoes of Marissa's screams still ringing in his ears. For the first time, he realized that the punishment had already begun, not in the form of a prison sentence, but in the unbearable knowledge that in one violent moment, he had lost his marriage, his freedom, and himself. And outside those barred walls, the world had already judged him guilty. The courthouse in Fulton County was packed to the walls the morning Richard Coleman's trial began. Reporters lined the steps, their cameras flashing as deputies escorted him through the doors in shackles. Headlines screamed from every newspaper, "Jealous husband turns killer." Inside, the wooden benches overflowed with townspeople, neighbors, and strangers alike, all eager to witness the fall of a man whose private heartbreak had exploded into public tragedy. Richard sat at the defense table in a plain gray suit, his shoulders hunched, his hands folded tightly in front of him. He looked thinner than he had in his mugshot, his once strong jaw now shadowed with lines of exhaustion. Across the room sat the prosecution team, crisp in dark suits, their files neatly stacked, their eyes sharp with resolve. At the front, Judge Morrison, a stern man in his 60s with a reputation for zero tolerance, peered down from the bench, his gavel ready to strike order into the tense air. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. The prosecution went first. Assistant District Attorney Paul Harrington rose, his presence commanding, his voice ringing clear. He strode before the jury with the confidence of a man who knew the weight of the evidence sat firmly in his favor. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case is not complicated. On a quiet afternoon, in a place where patients expect safety and trust, this man," he pointed toward Richard, his fingers sharp as a blade, "pulled out a loaded gun and executed Dr. Paul Henderson. He did so in cold blood, in front of witnesses, with no regard for the sanctity of life." His words painted Richard as a calculated murderer, a man who had carried his gun into the clinic with intent. He spoke of Henderson as a respected physician, beloved by patients, a man who had saved lives and given comfort. He did not, of course, mention the affair. That detail remained tucked away, known only to the people closest to the case. To the jury, Henderson was a hero, and Richard was the villain who gunned him down. The defense rose next. Linda Parker, a sharp defense attorney with silver streaks in her black hair, faced the jury with calm conviction. Her voice cut through the silence with quiet strength. "Yes, Richard Coleman fired that gun," she said, turning briefly to her client, who kept his eyes down. "We are not here to deny that fact. But what we are here to decide is why. Was this a man who set out that morning to kill? Or was this a husband, blindsided by betrayal, who acted in a moment of unbearable passion and devastation? He is not a monster. He is a man who lost control in the worst possible way." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Betrayal. The word hung heavy, and though Linda never outright said affair, her meaning was clear. The trial unfolded over days, each one stretching Richard thinner, each testimony peeling away the layers of his life. A nurse testified first, her voice trembling as she recalled the sound of the gunshot, the sight of blood splattering across sterile walls. The defense then called an unexpected witness, a former patient of Dr. Henderson's. A middle-aged woman with weary eyes stepped nervously to the stand. She clutched her purse tightly as she raised her hand to swear in. Her voice shook at first, but steadied as she spoke. "I went to Dr. Henderson last year," she said, "and I remember feeling uncomfortable. He stood too close. He lingered when there was no reason to. I told myself I was imagining it, but when I heard what happened with Mrs. Coleman, I knew I wasn't alone." The prosecution immediately objected, arguing that her account was irrelevant, but Judge Morrison allowed the testimony. The jury leaned forward, their eyes narrowing as the woman described subtle gestures and words that blurred the line between professionalism and something else entirely. When she stepped down, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. The testimony didn't excuse Richard's actions, but it planted a seed of doubt. Was Henderson truly the innocent saint painted by the prosecution, or was there a darker side that others had chosen to ignore? Richard glanced at the jurors, noticing the hesitation in their faces. For the first time, he wondered if someone in that box might actually understand the storm that had consumed him. "I heard Mrs. Coleman scream," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "It was chaos. Everyone ran. When I looked in, the doctor was on the floor, and Mr. Coleman was standing over him with the gun still in his hand." The prosecution emphasized the details, the way Richard had carried the weapon into a medical facility, the way he had aimed with precision. They spoke of forethought, of intent. This was not a crime of passion, Harrington hammered, but a deliberate act of violence. Then Marissa took the stand. Her entrance silenced the room. She wore a simple black dress, her hair pulled back, her eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights. As she raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth, Richard's heart twisted. This was the woman he had once vowed to protect, the woman whose smile had been the center of his world. Her voice wavered as she spoke. "That day, I made a mistake. I crossed a line with Dr. Henderson. But Richard," she looked toward her husband, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He walked in on something no husband should ever have to see." Marissa paused, her hands trembling as she gripped the edges of the witness stand. For a moment, she seemed almost unable to go on, her eyes darting to the floor as if searching for the right words. "I never planned any of it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Dr. Henderson, he made me feel seen at a time when I felt invisible in my own marriage. Richard worked so hard, but he barely looked at me anymore. I was lonely, and I let that loneliness blind me. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but it's the truth. I betrayed him, yes, but I never imagined it would lead to this." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some jurors leaned forward, captivated. Others shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward Richard, whose jaw was clenched, his eyes glassy with a pain deeper than anger. Marissa's voice rose slightly, carrying both guilt and desperation. "I loved my husband, even when I failed him. And now I have to live every day with the knowledge that my weakness, my mistake, pushed him into the darkest moment of his life. I will never forgive myself for that." He snapped. "He's not a violent man. He never laid a hand on me in anger. That moment was rage and heartbreak colliding. He didn't go there to kill anyone. He just lost control." The courtroom buzzed. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably, sympathy flickering in their eyes. Others looked away, unmoved. The prosecution cross-examined with ruthless precision. "Mrs. Coleman, are you telling this court that your husband's pain excused him from murdering a man in cold blood?" "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm saying he wasn't thinking. He wasn't himself." The defense brought Richard to the stand last. He spoke quietly, his voice raw. "I love my wife. I trusted her. I trusted him. When I opened that door, I saw my whole life crumble in front of me. I wasn't thinking about consequences. I wasn't thinking about prison or headlines. I just saw red. And in that second, I did something I can never undo." His words hung in the air, heavy and unvarnished. When closing arguments came, Harrington delivered fire and fury. "We cannot excuse murder because of hurt feelings. If we condone this, then every jealous spouse has the right to kill. That is not justice. That is chaos." Linda Parker delivered restraint and humanity. "Richard Coleman is guilty. Guilty of being human, of failing to control a storm of rage and betrayal. But he is not a cold-blooded killer. He is a man who deserves mercy, not the harshest judgment." The jury filed out, leaving the courtroom buzzing with whispers. each spectator caught between outrage and compassion. Hours passed. When they returned, every eye fixed on the foreman. We, the jury, find the defendant, Richard Coleman. The room held its breath. Guilty of voluntary manslaughter. Gasps filled the chamber. Richard's shoulders sagged, relief and despair colliding. He would face years behind bars, but not life. He would lose his freedom, but not his chance at someday walking free again. Judge Morrison struck his gavel, his voice stern. Sentencing will be set. Court is adjourned. As deputies led Richard away, he glanced back once more. Marissa was weeping silently, her head bowed, her hands clenched together as if in prayer. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, two lives shattered, bound forever by love, betrayal, and the bullet that had ended one man's life and destroyed another's. The courthouse was hushed the day Richard Coleman returned for sentencing. The trial had ended, the verdict delivered, but the air still carried the tension of a community torn in half. People crowded the benches, some there out of sympathy, others out of outrage, all of them waiting to see how many years would be carved from the rest of Richard's life. Judge Morrison sat solemnly at the bench, his gavel resting within reach. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were heavy, as though even he carried the weight of what had unfolded. Richard sat at the defense table in his gray suit, shackles on his wrists and ankles. He no longer looked like the husband who had once driven his wife to a doctor's appointment. He looked like a man hollowed out, waiting to be told how long his cage would last. The prosecution pressed for a harsh penalty. Voluntary manslaughter or not, a man is dead. Dr. Henderson was respected in this community. His patients trusted him. The defendant took his life with a firearm in broad daylight. This deserves no leniency. The defense, once more, pleaded for mercy. Linda Parker stood with calm conviction. Richard Coleman has accepted responsibility from the very moment he was arrested. He has not once denied what he did. But this was not an execution. It was a tragedy born of betrayal and blind rage. He will pay for it every day of his life, even outside these walls. The court should recognize the difference between a murderer and a man who lost control. Finally, Judge Morrison leaned forward, his voice steady and grave. Mr. Coleman, you committed an act of violence that cannot be undone. You took a life in a place meant for healing, in front of witnesses whose memories will be scarred forever. And yet, this court has also heard of your character, your years of hard work, and the circumstances that brought you here. Justice is not blind to either side. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Every eye in the room was fixed on him. It is the sentence of this court that you serve 15 years in the custody of the state of Georgia. The sound of his gavel echoed like thunder. Marissa let out a soft, broken sob from the gallery. Richard didn't flinch. He simply lowered his head, the finality of the moment sinking into his bones. 15 years. 15 years for one trigger pull that had destroyed 3 lives. His, Marissa's, and Henderson's. Outside the courthouse, the community remained divided. Some called the sentence too light, outraged that a man could kill and walk free again someday. Others felt sympathy, whispering that they might have done the same if betrayed so cruelly. The debate spilled into churches, diners, and barbershops, splitting neighbors and friends. At Harper's Diner, the conversations grew heated over steaming cups of coffee. One man shook his head and muttered, 15 years? That's nothing. You take a man's life. You ought to pay with your own. Across the booth, an older woman leaned in, her voice hushed but firm. Don't pretend you know what you'd do if you walked in on your wife with another man. Maybe none of us would have pulled that trigger, but don't tell me you wouldn't have felt the same rage. In the town's small Baptist church, Pastor Green spoke from the pulpit the following Sunday, his tone heavy with warning. Anger is a fire, he preached. It can consume a good man in seconds and leave nothing but ash. Brother Richard let that fire control him, and 3 lives were lost that day. Let this be a lesson, not to excuse sin, but to guard our hearts before fury takes hold. Even in the local barbershop, the case cut deep. A father with his young son on the chair said quietly, "Son, remember this. You can't let emotions rule your hands. Once you cross that line, you can't step back." The boy nodded solemnly, his wide eyes reflecting the weight of the lesson. Every corner of the community carried an opinion, and Richard's name became less of a man and more of a parable, whispered in kitchens, preached in pews, and passed down as a cautionary tale. For Marissa, the punishment went beyond the courtroom. She returned to an empty house, its walls echoing with silence. Her marriage was gone, her reputation in ruins, and the man she had once trusted more than anyone lay buried in the ground. She lived with both grief and guilt, condemned to replay the moment Richard opened that door every time she closed her eyes. Richard, meanwhile, was transported to a state prison. As the gates closed behind him, he felt the last thread of his old life snap. No more morning coffee in the kitchen, no more truck rides with Marissa, no more chance to undo the worst decision of his life. Only years of concrete walls, steel bars, and time. Time to think, time to regret, time to wonder if forgiveness was even possible. But even as the prison swallowed him whole, one thought echoed louder than all the others. The sound of the gunshot, the sound that would haunt him until the day he walked free, or the day he never walked free at all. The prison gates clanged shut behind Richard Coleman, their echo reverberating through his chest like a death knell. The world he had once known, the modest home, the sound of Marissa's laughter before it turned cold, the hum of his old Chevy on a quiet Georgia morning, was gone. In its place stood concrete walls, endless rows of steel bars, and the sharp smell of sweat, bleach, and despair. His first nights in the cell were the hardest. The thin mattress did nothing to soften the ache in his body, but it was the ache in his mind that kept him awake. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw it all again. The sterile white of the exam room, the look of shock on Henderson's face, the way Marissa screamed as blood spread across the floor. He would jolt awake, drenched in sweat, his own voice hoarse from shouting into the dark. Prison hardened him quickly. The other inmates gave him looks that mixed curiosity with caution. Word spread fast inside those walls. The guy who killed his wife's doctor. Some called him a fool. Others quietly respected the raw fury it took to do what he had done. But Richard didn't care about their judgments. His battles weren't with them. His war was inside. He kept mostly to himself, working in the laundry, keeping his head down, and counting the days. Yet in the stillness of the long nights, he found himself reaching for paper. He began to write letters to Marissa. At first, they were filled with anger, the questions he had never been able to ask. Why him? Why there? Why betray me in the one place I trusted you were safe? But as the months turned into years, the letters changed. The rage drained out, leaving behind something heavier, sorrow. He began writing apologies instead, apologies she would never read. "I'm sorry I let my pain turn me into this. I'm sorry I made you watch me pull the trigger. I'm sorry I destroyed the life we built together." He never sent the letters. They piled up in a small box under his bunk, unsent confessions scrawled in a shaky hand. Occasionally, he would hear from her. A short letter in careful script. "I don't hate you, Richard, but I can't forgive you either. I'm trying to move forward, but I still see it every night." Those words carved deeper than any sentence the judge had given. The years rolled on, and prison life became routine. Richard aged more quickly than he realized, his hair turning gray, his back stooping under the invisible weight of memory. The other inmates called him the Ghost, not because he was dangerous, but because he carried a haunted silence with him wherever he went. One winter evening, as he sat by the barred window watching snow fall softly against the razor wire, he thought about the man he used to be. a husband, a provider, someone who believed in loyalty above all else. That man had died in a doctor's office the day he pulled the trigger. What remained was only the shadow, left to live out a punishment far greater than the 15 years written on paper. Because Richard knew the truth. No judge, no jury, no prison could punish him more than his own memory already did. 15 years sounds like a number, a block of time neatly packaged by the court. But to Richard Coleman, each day felt like its own lifetime, measured not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the echo of a single gunshot that never stopped ringing in his ears. As the years dragged on, Richard came to accept that freedom, if it ever came, would be nothing like the life he had once known. He would walk out an old man, gray and tired, into a world that had moved on without him. The neighbors would remember only the headlines. The whispers would never die. And Marissa, she would never be his again. He stopped writing letters in his 10th year. The words had become too heavy, the apologies too repetitive. Nothing he wrote could change what she had seen, what she had lost. His final unsent letter ended with a single sentence. You deserved better than him, and better than me. He folded it neatly and tucked it into the box beneath his bunk, sealing away his last attempt at reaching her. Outside the prison walls, Marissa tried to rebuild a life. She moved out of their old house, unable to face the memories carved into its walls. Friends drifted away, unable to look at her without recalling the scandal. She worked quietly, kept to herself, and avoided questions. But the shadows of that day never left. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw Henderson's body on the floor and Richard's face twisted in pain. It was a wound that time could dull but never fully heal. The town, too, carried the memory. The case became a cautionary tale whispered over coffee and in church pews. Parents warned their children about the cost of anger, about the danger of letting betrayal turn into violence. Richard Coleman's name became less of a person and more of a lesson, an example of how quickly love could turn into destruction. In his final years behind bars, Richard found a strange kind of peace. He no longer fought against the bars or cursed the ceiling above his bunk. Instead, he spent hours staring out through the narrow window, watching the sky shift colors as seasons passed. Regret never left him, but it no longer burned. It simply lived inside him, a constant companion. On the 15th year, when the gates finally opened, Richard stepped out thinner, older, and quieter. The world outside felt too loud, too fast. He didn't search for Marissa. He knew better. Their lives had diverged the moment that gun fired, and no amount of apologies could ever bridge the gulf between them. As he walked down the road from the prison, his shadow stretching long in the afternoon sun, Richard carried with him the lesson carved deep into his soul, that betrayal can shatter, but rage can destroy. And of all the prisons a man could live in, none were harsher than the one built from his own choices. As Richard stepped beyond the prison gates for the last time, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the road. He walked slowly, his shoulders stooped, his hands clutching a small paper bag with the remnants of his prison life. Up ahead, a young family crossed the street, a father holding his wife's hand, their little girl skipping between them, her laughter ringing out like a melody Richard hadn't heard in years. He stopped, watching them, the scene striking him harder than the cold air. For a brief moment, he imagined himself in that role again, a husband walking beside Marissa, a protector, a man with a future. But the vision dissolved as quickly as it came, leaving only emptiness. The father glanced at him briefly, then pulled his family closer, as though sensing the shadow of a man who had once destroyed everything with a single choice. Richard turned away, his throat tight, and kept walking down the lonely road. He knew then, with brutal clarity, that freedom wasn't the same as redemption. Some prisons, the kind built from memory and regret, would follow him to the grave. The world moved on, but for Richard Coleman and those who remembered, the story of that single afternoon at a doctor's office remained a haunting reminder that love, trust, and fury are never far apart, and that one trigger, one moment, can change everything forever.